50,000 children never came home. That's not a statistic from a war. That's a number from a federal investigation published in 2022 about a government program in the United States that ran for 99 years. And the official policy, in its own words, was this: kill the Indian, save the man. That's not a historian's interpretation. That's a direct quote from the man who designed the system, from a speech he gave in 1892 to applause. His name was Richard Henry Pratt. He was a military officer, and what he built, with federal funding and congressional approval, ran for 99 years. Let me tell you what that looked like for one child. His name in the Carlisle Indian Industrial School admission record was Luther Standing Bear. He was Lakota Sioux. He arrived in Pennsylvania in 1879, and the first class of students ever admitted. He was 11 years old. The school told him to choose an English name from a list written on a blackboard. He didn't speak English. He didn't know what the words meant. He pointed to one. That became his name. His hair was cut the first week. Traditional Lakota hair was worn long. It carried meaning, identity, connection to ancestors. The school had scissors. The school had a schedule. And within 1 month, Luther Standing Bear was wearing a uniform, learning carpentry, and being punished for speaking his own language. He later wrote, "I was no longer an Indian." He meant it as a tragedy. The school considered it a success. By 1900, there were 153 boarding schools operating across 21 states. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was not just funding them, it was legally empowering local agents to remove children from families who refused to send them. Refused to send them. Here's the official version, and here's what doesn't fit. If this was education, why was it mandatory? Not suggested, not offered, mandatory. Parents who refused could have their rations cut, their land access restricted, their freedom of movement limited. Federal agents had authority to remove children if families resisted. That's not a school. That's a conscription system. And Pratt designed every detail of it with that in mind. The haircuts were not incidental. Lakota boys who arrived with their hair long left with it shaved. Hair that carried ceremonial meaning, that marked mourning, that identified band and lineage. The scissors were the first lesson. The uniforms came second. Military cut, identical. The names came third. English names from a blackboard, assigned to children who couldn't read what was written. The languages came last. Speaking Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, any native language was punishable. By detention, by meals withheld, by physical punishment at some schools. One survivor, interviewed for the 2022 Interior Department report, described being told that God did not hear prayers spoken in Indian languages. She was 7 years old. But this is where the story stops making sense. Reformers who supported these schools often genuinely believed they were helping. I've verified that. I've read the testimony. Some students did gain practical skills. Some became teachers, held public office. The record is not a single note. But that's the version the system wanted people to believe. Because here's what was happening on the other side of that belief. The Department of the Interior's 2022 investigation, the first federal investigation of its kind, identified more than 50 burial sites on or near boarding school properties. Children who died at these institutions, buried there, sometimes without their families being notified, sometimes under the names the school had assigned to them, not their own names. And it wasn't just the burial sites. Of the schools investigated, at least 19 had documented child deaths on record. The number of confirmed deaths exceeded 500, and those are only the ones with surviving documentation. Children who died away from home, buried under borrowed names, in soil far from everything they'd known. There's a man named Chauncey Yellowrobe. He was Lakota. He was sent to Carlisle. He survived. He became a teacher, a lecturer, an advocate. He spoke at universities. He testified before Congress. He was not a radical. He was not fringe. He was a man who had lived through the system and described what he found. And he said this in 1914. The reservation and the boarding school are both cages. One is bigger than the other. That is the only difference. But there was one man who said no entirely, at least for a while. Sitting Bull resisted sending his children for as long as he could. He was one of the most prominent Native leaders of the 19th century, the man who coordinated the resistance at Little Bighorn in 1876. And when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came for his children, he said no. The agent wrote to Washington, "He is obstinate and will not consent." Obstinate. A father, refusing to send his children, classified as obstinacy in a federal document. His children were eventually taken anyway. A daughter named Standing Holy went to a school in South Dakota. A son went to a government institution in the North. Sitting Bull wrote letters asking after them. The letters are in the archive. Some were never answered. He was killed in 1890 during an arrest attempt connected to the government's fear of the ghost dance movement, a spiritual practice it had classified as a threat. He never saw his children graduate. He never saw what the schools made of them. His daughter, Standing Holy, survived. She lived until 1927. By the time she died, she was the last person living who had been photographed with her father. What she remembered of him, the specific Lakota words he used, the way he spoke about the land, whether those survived, I don't know. The record doesn't say. Every system I've researched attacked identity, but none of them attacked the mechanism of thought itself. This one did. It attacked language first. When they lost their language, they didn't just lose words. They lost the ability to remember things the way their grandparents did. That's not an accident. That's a design. 3 generations of children went through these schools. 3 generations of parents who didn't know where their children were or why they came back speaking differently. 3 generations of grandparents watching their grandchildren forget the words they'd been given. But the most important thing in that report isn't what they found. It's what wasn't there. Some schools burned their own documentation, deliberately. And this is where the story stops being history and becomes a search. Because investigators started locating the burial sites. Some of them are now on private property or commercial property. In at least one case, a parking lot. A parking lot. I don't know what to do with that. I just keep thinking about the families who wrote letters asking where their child was buried. I don't know if those letters were answered, but the report has them. Records of families who asked, and records of institutions that didn't reply. Here's what I think matters most. The last boarding school closed in 1978. The same year, Star Wars opened in theaters. The same year, Sony released the Walkman. Within the living memory of people who are right now voting, working, raising their own children. And the communities that lost those 3 generations. The languages, the ceremonies, the specific ways of understanding the world that existed before Pratt had his blackboard and his scissors. Many of those things are gone. Not metaphorically. Gone in the specific way that things go when the people who would have taught them to the next generation were somewhere else, learning carpentry. The first federal investigation of this system began in 2021, 143 years after the school at Carlisle opened. The investigation is ongoing. Burial sites are still being identified. Tribal nations are asking for remains to be returned home. The 2022 report contained no apology from the federal government, no reparation framework, no law that calls what happened by its name. In 2009, Congress passed a resolution of apology to Native peoples for historical injustices. It was attached to a defense appropriations bill. It included a clause specifying that nothing in the apology could be used as a basis for legal claims. An apology with a legal waiver attached. Luther Standing Bear lived until 1939. He wrote 4 books. He testified in Congress. He argued for Native rights to land, to governance, to cultural practice. He said the school had taken something from him that he spent his entire adult life trying to reconstruct. He also wrote this: "The white man does not understand the Indian for the reason that he does not understand America." He wasn't angry when he wrote it. He was attempting to explain. He was trying to hand something across the distance that the school had created. The system ended, but the investigation didn't. The graves are still being found. The records are still incomplete. And somewhere in those files, incomplete, fire-damaged, sometimes missing entirely, there are still children who were never returned. So this isn't history. This is a search that hasn't finished yet. The question isn't what happened. The question is, how many are still missing? If someone came to your mind while watching this, there's a reason for that. The pattern continues. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.